Hello and welcome to this video. I'm here because of an art form, music. That's probably the most basic, simple statement I have ever made on this channel. But it's sort of profound when you think about it. Why aren't I talking about poetry? Why aren't I talking about, architecture? Why music? Why am I talking about music? It is because, being born in 1968, I grew up in an era which we could almost call the rock era, where the most important art form on the planet, which seemed to come along and direct all cultural stuff going on, happened at that time. Late 20th century music, rock and roll, prog, disco, punk, all the stuff, including house music and hip hop and a whole lot. The second half of the 20th century was dominated by music as a cultural form. This music has its roots in American music. Jazz, blues, country, gospel. Okay? And popular music grows out of that. If we go to the early part of the 20th century, we see a revolution going on musically. A revolution that will come along and usurp classical music, orchestral music. It's going to bring in new ways of approaching music. It's going to create geniuses, but these geniuses are not going to be the virtuoso compositional geniuses of Bach or Mozart. They're going to have different qualities. It's going to be a cultural shift, a seismic shift that goes with the seismic cultural events that are happening in the 20th century. So when we look at this thing, 20th century music, right? There's another name we could call it, not pop music, not rock music. There's a name which encapsulates the whole thing for me, and that name would be recorded music. Recording was invented in the Victorian era, late Victorian era, around about 1860, 1870. When it was first invented, what was the thing they first recorded? Not music, people talking. People talking was interesting. You could hear a voice, you could communicate stuff. But pretty soon they thought, we could also record music with this. And what was the music they recorded? Classical music, like light opera, a little bit of folk music. Nobody thought of going over to America and starting to record this obscure folk music that was emerging in there. And so we have no idea, really, what the sound of American folk music, by that I mean jazz, blues, country, gospel, all that stuff. We have no idea until it starts to be recorded. And the first recording is, of course, the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. And once that recording is made, right, it lights a fire because it sold a lot. And suddenly the record companies, sniffing the money, turn around and go, right, who else is out there? And that thing of looking into an area that they don't really understand has allowed geniuses to come through in all sorts of different styles of music. And the thing is, their genius is different. On this video, I'm going to go through the 10 most important or greatest musicians of the 20th century. That's what I'm going to try and do on here, and I'm sure I'm going to fail because this music form has been made by thousands of different musicians, and so many important landmarks and innovations are made by musicians you never know about. But I'm still going to try and do this because it tells a story. It tells a story of 20th century music. This is, of course, only my opinion, but these are the ones I picked. In 6 months' time, I would probably pick a different list. I'm going to talk about these musicians as I go. They are not ranked. Oh, no, sorry, they are ranked. It was the last video where they're not ranked. I have ranked these musicians in importance. I had the gall and audacity to do that as well. So, yes, I have them. They are ranked. So don't panic, they are ranked. Because I know you like to see they're ranked, because you can sit there thinking, so who's Andy going to say is the most important musician of the 20th century? By the end of this video, you will know. You will know, I will have told you. And then you can agree or disagree. So if you're sitting comfortably, right, in a nice company, or on your own, with some biscuits perhaps, you know, nice cup of tea, slippers on, I will now go through this list, and I'll be jumping all over the place historically, because there's a part of me that wants to go historically through this list, but I think it's more important to go through the musicians and talk about their importance and see why I think one musician is more important than the other. So at number 10, I have a very, very important musician that I have never ever mentioned on this channel. A musician that I don't know that much about, so I'm going to struggle to say why I put him on the list when I don't know that much about him. And that musician is Bob Marley. Now, Bob Marley is one of these iconic musicians that if I go down to the local market and I wander around, maybe I'm going to buy some dog food or maybe a cushion, there is always a stall proffering pencil drawings of iconic musicians. And I tell you, the musicians that they always have is, one would be Kurt Cobain, the other would be Tupac Shakur. Is that the right name? If I said that wrong, just gloss over it. It didn't sound right when I said it. And the other would be Bob Marley. Bob Marley is loved with the general public. He's one of the biggest recording artists of all time. Now, when I ask myself why that is, I think it's because there is this whole world in pop music that is infused pop music. And if we listen to the stuff that's in the charts now, we would hear so much influence that is going back to Jamaican music, is going back to reggae, and then back to that to ska. So many important musicians were important in that history. We could mention Jimmy Cliff, you know, the sort of superstar of ska, if you want, in the 60s, with so much importance happening in the UK in terms of rock music, because we had the Beatles and the Stones, and then Cream and Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, all that, because that's all going on. The influx of the Windrush generation, those immigrants that came to England, although they weren't technically immigrants because they were coming from our Commonwealth, you know. These people who came here feeling that they were going to another country, you know, that was also headed by their queen, and then arriving and hitting all the racism and trying to integrate themselves into our culture. A massive influence it has on jazz and blues, which really forms rock music. You know, there were musicians in, like someone like Joe Harriott, for example. There were musicians in the UK in the late 50s, early 60s that really understood this music form and lived it. Now, with that, we have this influx of Jamaican music, ska and then reggae. Now, there's one musician for me, and I think for everybody, that more than anybody else is the cornerstone of that, and that's Bob Marley. Now, I think the reason why Bob Marley is so important, because there's other elements. It's not just about bringing Jamaican influences in. By coming into the UK, being signed to Island Records, and being almost like a product of the British music scene as much as the Jamaican music scene, I think Bob Marley brings in certain elements that are very important into reggae. One of them is the sort of guitar playing, that sort of Peter Tosh, which is that sort of Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix style blues rock sound, which is in there. So much so that Eric Clapton could do a cover version of I Shot the Sheriff, and it sounds right because that influence is in there. But with Dylan, you also have that songwriter influence that's come through from Bob Dylan. The songs are very important, the lyrics are very important. This is very sophisticated music, but it's sophisticated not just musically, but, you know, from a sort of lyrical point of view. And I think this elevates Bob Dylan up. So those songs being so great, those songs imprinting on culture so much more, and the influence of that reggae sound, which we then start to see emerging in punk. You know, we see the Clash covering reggae songs, we see the Police, we see that the influence coming into popular music here in the UK. You then get things like Madness and the Specials, you get UB40, you know, but we've also got, what's the name of that band, the Steel Pulse, all these bands that emerge. You know, when I was growing up in the 1980s, a lot of pop music that was coming out in the UK was reggae influenced. There's a whole ton of it. And these are huge things. Now, that for me, that whole influx, and now when you put pop record on it, and it has that sort of Mozambique reggae influence. And all that thing, really, more than anybody else, if there's one musician we can point to, and it's not just Bob Marley, but if we're just going to point to one as being the sort of figurehead of that, of course it's Bob Marley. So I have spoken as much as I can about Bob Marley with the limited knowledge I have of him. I hope I did okay, and I hope I have proved that there is some objectivity there to be able to, stand outside myself and go, I can see Bob Marley's really important. Now, you're probably thinking I don't like Bob Marley. I actually really do like Bob Marley. I think he's great. And when I was very young, I actually joined a reggae band called Capital Letters for about 4 months. And I didn't know how to play reggae, and they told me to listen to Babylon by Bus, which I did for about a month solid. And I loved it. And Peter Tosh I really loved, and I have albums by Peter Tosh. But I think it's the heaviness. I'm also a massive fan of dub reggae, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Lee Scratch Perry, all of that I absolutely love. But I am meandering away from this tale. But of course, all that music, all that Massive Attack, everything has got that sound. And I'm going to lay it at Bob Marley's feet. Right, shall I go to number 9 now and get a move on? Because I can feel this is going to be a long one. At number 9, I have a musician that I have done a whole video on. And if you want to check it out, it's there. If I remember to put the thing there, because sometimes I don't, and I just point to me there. But if it's not there, I'm pointing to a video that I made about Lead Belly. Lead Belly, as I've been studying the history of 20th century popular music forms, more and more I can see influences there that are so important. Now, Lead Belly, of course, is not a musician that emerges in the normal route. This wasn't somebody that sort of played their music and then entered the music industry, was recorded, had a big load of success, he wrote a whole bunch of songs. No, Lead Belly is born in the Victorian era in America, and he comes up in that period when all this stuff, this American music, was being formed, the period that we don't know about. He goes right back to that. But rather than becoming a big star, like, Charlie Patton or Blind Lemon Jefferson, around about 1918, I think, somewhere around about there, he commits murder and he gets stuck in prison. And folklorists, Alan Lomax, John Lomax, they're sort of travelling around America trying to record, and because even back then in the 30s, people wanted to put their hands on this American music form because it had emerged into jazz and swing, and all this sort of stuff. So they want to find out what it is. So he starts going around the prisons, and they find Lead Belly. Now, Lead Belly, the thing that nobody says, he was an incredible performer. He was one of the greatest 12-string guitarists around at that time. An incredible voice, a balladeer. And he wasn't just a blues artist, he understood sort of folk forms, ragtime, all that stuff he'd got in his arsenal of songs. An incredible performer. And this is like his record deal when he's recorded by the Lomaxes in the 1930s, and people start to hear it. They hear it was something extremely new that they'd never heard of, but also they hear the beginnings, they hear back to the roots of American music in a way. Lead Belly becomes a great star. He puts a whole bunch of records out. By the time he comes to the 1940s, he is a star, and he's doing gigs, and he's been taken on by the sort of middle class intelligentsia. This happens a lot with sort of these sort of folk forms. Now, I'm going to tell you where I think the influence is. I'll give you one line of the influence so you can see what I mean. Lead Belly recorded a bunch of songs. Here in the UK, we don't really have jazz. There's no blues or jazz. We're a British country. We haven't got it. It's not there. It's a different thing here. Our jazz scene starts to emerge in the late 1940s. Certain musicians are listening to Charlie Parker and they're trying to play that music, but much bigger was the trad jazz boom. which would be people like Chris Barber and Ken Collier, Humphrey Lyttelton. There's this boom that happens, traditional jazz. Now, traditional jazz, they were purists. They were going back to New Orleans jazz, and they were trying to do it exactly right. They didn't like all this bebop and this new stuff. They wanted it to sound like that. And they start to listen to all these different songs, and all these elements start to come out. The blues starts to emerge out of that. There's an interest in the blues, and they start to bring over to Britain, American blues artists is really important. We're going to talk about this in a bit. But also, at the same time, you've got, within that trad thing, they're listening to the folk music of Lead Belly. Now, here in the UK in the 1950s, a superstar emerged. One of the big pop artists of the 1950s was Lonnie Donegan. Now, I think Lonnie Donegan had started out in Chris Barber's band, but he starts to re-record some of Lead Belly's songs. And the thing about Lonnie Donegan is, rather than focusing on the sort of virtuoso aspects of jazz, he focuses on, and this is something that's always been in there, these are two things that sort of counterbalance each other. The accessibility of it. And this creates a thing called the skiffle boom. Skiffle is so important in the 1950s, and we can sort of almost go straight back to Lead Belly as being the progenitor of that. Is that a word? I've used it. I just thought, shall I use that word? I have used it. So if it is a word, and I hope I've got the right meaning, I went for it. Anyway, so he starts to record these Lead Belly songs. Skiffle emerges, and skiffle's really, it's like punk rock. British musicians or wannabe musicians can express themselves because they've got acoustic guitar. You've got the chords, you just strum some open chords. If you've got like a washboard that your mum would be doing the washing with, not to be sexist, but there were no dads doing that. So they could scratch that and get a rhythm. You know, people would get a broom handle and tie a string to it, and then they would stick it on a tea chest for it would resonate, and they'd pluck the string and pull it back and do that, and they would get a bass line. And through that, musicians who hadn't got the access, the money to get proper instruments, could start making music. Suddenly, the working classes could make music, and in that was a whole bunch of musicians that suddenly could express themselves, most notably the Beatles. You know, the Quarrymen was a skiffle group. This goes directly back to Lead Belly, right? Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin, you can go and check the video out. He was interviewed in the late 50s because he was in a skiffle band, and it was such a craze that they'd done a TV feature on it and gone out to London and found some kid who was into skiffle. It was Jimmy Page. But on the other side, the great genius that turns rock and roll into rock music, who is Bob Dylan, he's also going back to these people. He's also going back to Woody Guthrie, and Woody Guthrie goes back to Lead Belly. Lead Belly was a treasury of these songs, and he was the one who put those songs down, and these songs go beyond the blues. He wasn't a blues artist, he was an American folk artist. So that's who I've got at number 9 is Lead Belly. Even today, where everyone's arguing about woke. Is woke a good thing or it's a bad thing? Or you called it woke, you're using that as a derogatory term. All this thing that's going on about woke. I hear woke all day long. You know who originated that? I'll tell you who it was. It was Lead Belly. When he wrote that song about the Scarborough Boys. And I've done a whole video on it. It's very interesting. Right. Next up we have at number 8, Jimmie Rodgers. I am now going to talk about country music. Yes, country music. I'm actually going to talk about country music on my channel. So, country music is like the X factor. If we take rock and roll can be seen as rhythm and blues. Oh, hang on, I've got a phone call. I'll be back in a bit.
There's too much water in that kettle. And now the lid's on crooked. And that means disaster for this lady. Because she is on a boat. Don't boil a kettle on a boat.
Hello, I'm back. I'm sorry about that. I had a phone call, but I managed to turn it into a nice little ad break for you. One more advert in a sea of adverts. There's so much adverts on here. Everyone moans about it. But without that, I can't keep the channel going. So I hope you enjoyed that little advert of mine there. So we're talking about Jimmie Rodgers. Jimmie Rodgers, he's a shadowy character, right? Very, very important. As I was saying before, country music is like, you mix it with rhythm and blues, and you got rock and roll. You see, and so many times then when you see, like, for example, in the 60s when Dylan comes out, that rock and roll then mixes again with country music. That songwriter aspect comes in, and that seems to propel forward rock music. And in country music has been in there all the way through. So when we look at the history of country music, who is the character? Who is probably the most important character? Well, Jimmie Rodgers has been called the father of country music. He was there in the Big Bangs, and I think the Big Bang in country music that happened in 1927. So before then, country music wasn't called country music. There was a collection of different sort of folk forms that existed. The reason why genres happen in the 20th century is because they sold records. If a certain group of artists were selling records and they could market it, then they would call it a name. You know, so country music was often called Western music, and Western swing, then country and Western. So there's a whole bunch of artists getting recorded. I think the first country recording is 1922, but in 1927 there was a series of recordings done, which were field recordings, which have become to be known as the Bristol Sessions. And this was a sort of big bang for country music and many other music forms as well. On those sessions, there were two very important artists recorded. One was the Carter family and one was Jimmie Rodgers. Now, Jimmie Rodgers at that point had been around for a while. He was in his early 30s, I think, at that time. He'd done all sorts of stuff, all different jobs, but he'd not just played country music, but he had influence that goes back to European folk music, which is yodeling, you know, like they do in Switzerland. He got that thing going on. He got the yodel. He'd also played in some jazz groups, so he got a blues things going on. And what Jimmie Rodgers really does is pull all those influences together. And the relationship between jazz, blues and country in the 1920s, they're much more closer than they are seen now. Jimmie Rodgers pulls all those together. He makes those recordings, and those recordings are really, really important. 1927. It turns him into a superstar. And his sort of rhythm and blues infected yodely country music becomes the blueprint of what we think has been country music. A few years later, when Hank Williams emerges, and I nearly had Hank Williams on this list, a lot of the time when you listen to Hank Williams, he is singing a blues, and Hank Williams goes directly back to Jimmie Rodgers, but so does Bob Dylan. He goes directly back to Jimmie Rodgers. If we listen to something like, I don't know, Lynyrd Skynyrd. Lynyrd Skynyrd has elements of Jimmie Rodgers. He is the first superstar of country music. He's the guy that pulls it all together. He's the guy that's a big success. Carter family as well. But as a specific individual musician, the shout has to go to Jimmie Rodgers, who I've got at number 8. At number 7, I've got another Jimmy. Of course, I've got Jimi Hendrix. We're all prog fans, rock fans, classic rock fans, heavy metal fans, you know, psychedelic rock fans. We're fans of jazz fusion, jazz rock, all these things that we talk about on this channel. There's one guy that seems to sit at the crossroads of all of that music, and it's Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix seems to have attributes from so many different aspects of rock and roll and rock music. He seems to personify so much in that one person. A musician that was really only active for 3 years. It's such an incredible achievement what Hendrix did. And I've talked about Hendrix on this channel before, but in doing the research that I do, going back through history and finding out the roots of these things, if you're looking at the history of progressive rock, for example, and we'll talk about Sgt. Pepper, and we'll talk about In the Court of the Crimson Kings, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, all these albums, I've just done a video on this. And then you look at the time scale. In 1967, the same year that the Beatles were doing Sgt. Pepper, Hendrix was recording Electric Ladyland. Electric Ladyland is seems to me light years ahead of anything else. And it seems to encompass everything: jazz, blues, avant-garde, psychedelic, folk. All these things are all concentrated together, and I think Hendrix is so open to everything and pulling all these things in that he gets marginalised because of that. We see him as a guitarist, but he wasn't a guitarist, he was a singer-songwriter. He was an iconic musician, he had a look, he had a performance style, he was a studio experimenter. He really was so much more than just a great guitar player. He was so much more than just a great singer-songwriter. He was so much more than just an iconic artist, you know. He was one of the first black musicians really to cross over into the mainstream. You know, at the time he was called the Black Elvis Presley. Where do we start with Jimi Hendrix? And why have I chosen him? Well, I feel that there is a move that happens from rock and roll to rock music. It happens in the 1960s. And I think the personification of what actually happens is most illuminated by pointing at Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix wrote pop songs that got in the charts. Jimi Hendrix pushed instrumental virtuosity to the fore. He pulled from modal jazz and free jazz. He used the studio to create new sounds, and he also used the guitar to create new sounds. But he was also visually incredible. His performance at Monterey when he sets fire to the guitar is perhaps the greatest performance in rock music history. His look, his voice, the songwriting, the lyrical matter which he's pulling from Bob Dylan, all these things are apparent in his music. And his first album, Are You Experienced?, is groundbreaking, absolutely groundbreaking. The next album, Axis Bold Love, he has moved even further forward. And then it's 68. It's like a year. Electric Lady album was recorded in 67, right? He signed in 67. In that 1 year, he'd gone for those 3 albums. What we're going to hear afterwards, all these recordings that have now emerged after he died, that was made at the same in 68, 69, Band of Gypsies, you know, Cry of Love, all these incredible things. I can't actually get my words out when it comes to Hendrix to really try and explain that for me, he personifies rock music. He personifies jazz fusion. He personifies progressive rock. He personifies the iconic rock star, the frontman. He's got it all and more. There's more to Hendrix than just that. And you can get lost in any of the worlds that he created. But what's astonishing is all this was done in a matter of months, and then he was gone. And the fact that he died young has made him even more iconic in the terms of rock history. It's like a shooting star. I'm sure you all know about Jimi Hendrix. I don't want to go through the details. I'd rather talk about the Jimmy in grand sweeps. I'd rather try and step back and go, look at this guy. Look what he did when he arrived in London. The way he brought, you know, real blues, you know, the music of the South, country music, all that he brought to London when London was going through this explosion which is rooted in rhythm and blues and the blues. You know, people like Clapton and Jeff Beck, they're all trying to, you know, forge this new music, and then you get the real deal arrive right in the middle of it, and it's just like an explosion. It's an explosion. He couldn't have done that in the States. He had to come to the UK. There is so much to talk about with Jimi Hendrix, and I will be here for too long if I do, but that's who I've got at number 7 is Jimi Hendrix. At number 6, above Jimi Hendrix, right? So all these people I'm going to talk about, I have rated above Jimi Hendrix in this list. Above Jimi Hendrix, I have Ray Charles. Now, Ray Charles is a musician that goes back far enough to have emerged in the 1940s. So, out of swing, out of jazz, out of rhythm and blues emerged a number of artists in the 1940s. People like Louis Jordan, Fats Waller, Nat King Cole, and they're all exploring different aspects of jazz. And they're exploring the more commercial side of jazz. Ray Charles emerged in the late 40s as really in the style of Nat King Cole. He's a fantastic piano player. He's got that silky voice, and he is ploughing that territory that Nat King Cole already done. That's what he's doing. But he's a searching musician. This is a guy that that was blinded, right, when he was young. So he's had to survive, and in that period of American history, as a black person who is blind. So for him to arrive as a recording artist by the 40s, this guy has got vision. That's the whole thing. He's got a vision. He's got a force of personality, a force of will. Ray Charles is a force of nature. He is making this sort of Nat King Cole style jazz, but he has an idea, because he has grown up in the church. He has grown up with church music. And he thinks of the rhythm and blues, and he thinks of the gospel music, and he thinks of putting those together. Could I sing a gospel song, but not gospel lyrics, but with earthy lyrics? Right, going back to the blues. And of course, at the time, there was a lot of pushback for this to happen. You know, to rework gospel songs, but with these sort of profane lyrics. And in 1954, think about this, before rock and roll, he goes into the studio and he records I Got a Woman, right? And I Got a Woman is a gospel song, but with profane lyrics, you know. And he sings a song about a woman that he knows across town that is good for him, right? He's not singing about love, he's singing about the pleasures of casual sex. That's what Ray Charles is singing about on that song. It's unbelievably groundbreaking. With that song, that is the beginning of soul. That is the beginning of funk. That is the beginning of that black music line that is going to, you know, produce musicians like James Brown, like Aretha Franklin. It's going to create Motown and Stax. Ray Charles is that important. And the thing with Ray Charles is he still keeps going. Every record he's pushing the envelope. He's bringing in jazz influences. He records an album of country songs. Again, he takes that country influence and brings it back in, creating a style of music that we hear today in someone like John Legend. That's Ray Charles is so important, and a genius musician, a brilliant pianist with an incredible voice. He lays the groundwork for sort of 16th note patterns, which are coming in through boogie woogie, for funk grooves, you know. He brings in sort of Latin American rhythms. All these influences come through. He's continually innovating, and he's continually pushing the envelope. So that's why I got number 6 is Ray Charles, an absolute giant of this music. So who is greater than Ray Charles? Well, at number 5, I have Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters is the blues musician that grew up in the 1920s and 30s out of that sort of Delta country blues sound. He's grown up with that acoustic blues of Charlie Patton, of Blind Lemon Jefferson, of Tommy Johnson, Lonnie Johnson, Robert Johnson's, all the Johnsons. You know, Muddy Waters has grown up. He's an illiterate, itinerant musician from the South, right? He understands that he's got the voice. He's got this deep growling voice. He's got the guitar style. He's got the aggression. He's got the attitude. But what Muddy Waters does when he signs a deal, late 40s, early 50s, is he electrifies the blues. Right? From him follows Howlin' Wolf. From him follows rhythm and blues, rock music, heavy metal, heavy rock. It all goes back to Muddy Waters. He's the most important musician. And Muddy was then picked up in the UK blues boom and brought over and toured here, shocking everybody with his electric band. Now, people who saw those gigs, and I've spoken to them, said that at the time he was playing through a guitar amp that was no bigger than probably a transistor radio, you know, probably about, you know, 5 watts or 10 watts. It wasn't a loud band. He wasn't rocking in that way. It still related back to that acousticness, but the reason it sounds so heavy is because of his voice and his sound and approach and the darkness of the blues and that sort of killer aesthetic that goes in it, the sort of the hunter with the prey, all that's Muddy Waters, absolutely huge influence. There's no Led Zeppelin without Muddy Waters. There's no Jimi Hendrix. There's no Cream. He's the guy that really we can point at that creates rock music, I would say. And of course, in electrifying the blues and writing those songs or recording those songs that became the staples that those British blues bands were trying to play, that he is the beginning of so much music that's happened in the 20th century. At number 4, I have even greater, I think, than Muddy Waters, but in the same lineage. After Muddy Waters, we get Chuck Berry. And Chuck Berry's very important for a number of reasons. On his hit record, which I think is also 1954, same as the Ray Charles I Got a Woman, Maybelline is rhythm and blues mixed with country music. Remember I said that's the magical ingredient, that's where rock and roll comes from. Well, the guy that invented that is Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry really is the inventor of rock and roll. You've got that sort of boogie-woogie piano influence of Fats Domino, you got the track in 1949, The Fat Man by Fats Domino, very important. With Earl Palmer's backbeat, that's the beginning of the backbeat, that's the straightening up of the swing pulse. But Chuck Berry's there doing similar stuff, but the bringing in of the country influence into rhythm and blues. So when you listen to Maybelline, that is a country song, but it's also a rock and roll song. And the thing is, the shock of somebody singing like that with that voice that's coming out of Hank Williams, and then finding out that this is a black musician, this is all the shock. But also the emphasis he places on the guitar. A lot of these early rock and roll bands, they were basically coming out of Louis Jordan, so it was double bass, drums, saxophone, like the sort of Bill Haley sort of approach to rock and roll. But Chuck Berry brings the guitar in, and this is coming out of T-Bone Walker. And the other thing he gets from T-Bone Walker is the showboating. It's playing the guitar behind your neck, the duck walk, all this sort of stuff coming out of Chuck Berry. He makes the guitar centre stage. When we put something like Johnny B. Good, that is perhaps the most iconic guitar part of all time, isn't it? When he comes in and goes... Now what we have, if you analyse that, we get this. That's Elmore James. Blues. And then he does this. That's not a blues lick, that's a bebop lick, that's Charlie Christian. So we get, in that first phrase, we get Elmo James and Charlie Christian. And then later on, he goes back to the Elmo James and he goes, that's the early diddly, that's the classic guitar lick. Everything is in there. The groundwork with Chuck Berry in his image, his performance, the integration of country music into rhythm and blues, and putting the guitar centre stage and creating the basically almost like being the Charlie Parker of rock and roll in that Chuck Berry created the phrasing, he created the sound, he created the thing that rock and roll is, that makes it different from Louis Jordan or rhythm and blues or Fats Waller or anything that's gone before. So that's who I've got number 4. Is Chuck Berry. Who's more important than Chuck Berry? Well, we're going to go further back. We're going to go back to the late 20s, early 30s. Jazz has emerged in 1917. It's been recorded. We've got New Orleans traditional jazz. It's sold a lot of records. And jazz slowly moves from the small group, which is based upon the frontline group that came out of New Orleans, which is a clarinet, trombone and cornet. It moves to the big band. It takes on elements of the sort of light dance orchestras, And in the 20s, we get groups like Paul Whiteman emerge, who's a white musician, taking jazz and sort of almost like orchestrifying it. And we also have Fletcher Henderson. And Fletcher Henderson is a lot more closer to that sort of New Orleans jazz sound. And he pioneers big band jazz. Those arrangements then go into people like Benny Goodman, and we get the development of swing. Now, swing is the sort of first real pop music. This is selling millions of records, and it becomes the sound of America in the 30s. And this is the time where people buying records are diminished for all sorts of various reasons. The record sales start to drop down, and the radio starts to become more important. And these bands, these big bands, are touring around America, and they're getting hits through the radio, right? We get people like Artie Shaw, we get people like Chick Webb. We've got a whole bunch of groups coming out, you know, on the Afro-American side. We've got Chick Webb, we've got Count Basie. There's a whole group of big bands emerging at that time. Benny Goodman's very important in creating this huge commercial market. You see the whiteification of big band jazz. You see Fletch Henderson going into these white superstars like Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman. There's so much I could discuss around that, but what's important of that is that this creates the first superstars. It's the first pop music. There's an argument that the first real pop star was Gene Krupa, the drummer with Benny Goodman. Then, of course, Frank Sinatra comes in. He's singing for the Dorsey Brothers in that big band, and then suddenly Frank Sinatra emerges as sort of teeny bop superstar in the 1940s, really creating the blueprint for Elvis Presley. You know, we've always had Bing Crosby. Now, I'm talking about swing jazz, but who is the greatest artist in swing jazz? Undoubtedly, it's Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington, who came from a middle-class, educated family out in Washington that had a completely different upbringing to someone like Louis Armstrong, and believed in the artistic worth of what he was doing. He turns down his arts degree, scholarship, and he forms a big band. And he starts to write material which from day one is very sophisticated, taking its lead from Fletcher Henderson. Duke Ellington turns big band jazz, he helps turn it into swing, but more importantly, he helps to turn it into an art form. Louis Armstrong is the great musician of jazz, and therefore of the 20th century. Duke Ellington is the great composer, and his breakthrough as a composer was to compose music that was on the same level as classical music, but rather than writing for a predictable ensemble, i.e. an orchestra, he was writing for the musicians he had in his band. He would not arrange for saxophone, trumpets, trombones. He wasn't arranging for that. He was arranging for Johnny Hodges or Bubba Myler or any of these musicians that he had in his group. Paul Gonzalez, all these musicians. He heard them when he arranged. He integrated them into his band. He was very successful at being able to weave and dodge and keep that band going. That band used to fight, that used to bicker. Duke Ellington would use that bickering to actually keep the band together, to up the ante, and him corralling these genius musicians creates an art form. And jazz was an art form before that. Louis Armstrong did that, but Louis Armstrong did it in a different way. Duke Ellington forges something that has worth. He has these ideas of creating, musical shows, of creating like orchestral pieces almost, of suites. And the driving force and his influence on big band jazz is unquestionable. For me, he is the second greatest jazz musician of all time. And his influence is jazz, which I won't go into, is also incredibly profound. But I think his influence on popular music is even more profound. And when we listen to a lot of the popular music and the arrangements that we hear behind Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett or an Ella Fitzgerald, or even a Doris Day, that all goes back to Duke. So that is who I've got. Who I've got at number 3 is Duke Ellington. So we're at number 2 now. So who have I got at number 2? Well, it is, of course, Bob Dylan. The greatest musician of the last 60 years. The musician that through his artistic achievements in the early 60s lay all the foundations for all the music forms that come on after that. When I started that out, I talked about the importance of Bob Dylan, of his influence in Bob Marley, that singer-songwriter influence, that idea of singing from your own personal perspective and talking about your own feelings. It's in Bob Marley. The other musician that came in after Bob Dylan that we've talked about was Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix was the same and actually recorded Dylan's songs. Dylan, again, middle class musician, middle class family. You know, he has got an interest in the folk music of black musicians, but also white musicians like Jimmie Rodgers. So he's got an interest in Jimmie Rodgers, he's got an interest in Robert Johnson, he's got an interest in Charlie Patton, he's got an interest in Lead Belly. But he warms to the music of Woody Guthrie. Now, Woody Guthrie was an intensely political singer-songwriter that had heard the music of Lead Belly, but he used it to make political statements, something that Lead Belly had done. He not only is a fan of Woody Guthrie, but Bob Dylan goes out and he hooks up with Woody Guthrie. He starts to take all this influence. You know, Woody Guthrie dies relatively young in the 50s, but the spirit of what he's doing, and also artists like Pete Seeger and the whole folk thing, it's all fed into Bob Dylan. All these influences as well. And we described, you know, the influences of this folk music on British music that's ended up in skiffle. But what we have in America in the early 60s is a folk, you know, sort of coffee house folk scene emerge. There's all sorts of different artists. And this is all about, you know, trying to be as authentic as possible. You know, trying to sing these old folk songs and sing them in a way that is authentic. And we hear that at that time. Dylan comes out with his first album. This is a very important album because on that album he sings all these classic old folk songs. They're not his songs, and introduces those songs into the mix. The second album, Freewheeling, he does the same thing, but he records his own songs. He starts to put his own feelings in. He sings in his own voice. He doesn't sing beautifully because he wants people to focus on the lyrics, not his voice. He starts to look at the instrumentation. He starts to take the popular song and expand it out into long form. This is all a big breakthrough. But he doesn't stop there. He then, you know, taking his lead from stuff that's happening in rock music, rock and roll, he starts to bring in electric instruments. You know, by 1965, when he records Like a Rolling Stone, that song is so far ahead in the future, it's hard to get your head round the fact that Like a Rolling Stone was recorded in 1965. It's a rock song. 65 before anybody. You know, that's an album, that sounds like a song from the 70s. He's got that backbeat, he's got the electric guitar, he's got the length of the song, the expansiveness of the song, the lyrics of the subject matter. It just is it's light years away from God Golly Miss Molly. You know, it's light years away from that. And that travel from 62 to 65 with Dylan is remarkable. And it's so remarkable and so influential that every band after that is changed. He really does. Without Dylan, there is no Beatles, there's no Stones, there's no Who, there's no King Crimson, there's no Frank Zappa. None of that would happen without Dylan. Now, people find this hard to understand. They go, well, Frank Zappa was influenced by Bob Dylan. On Freak Out, he's in the list of influences. Frank Zappa said that when he heard that what Dylan had done, it gave him the inspiration to do what he wanted to do, which was pull blues and classical music. Before that, he was just playing rhythm and blues and doo-wop. But when he heard Dylan, it inspired him for him to do what he wanted to do. He knew that he could get up and sing. It didn't matter if he couldn't sing well. That didn't matter. And when you put on, you know, albums like Blonde on Blonde, and there's tracks that are, for the time, really long 10-minute tracks, you know, with improvisation, and they've got this space and all that going on. It inspired musicians to push forward. Dylan's genius wasn't just to influence where people sound like Dylan, and believe me, there's so many people who took that influence. You know, from Joni Mitchell to who else? You know, Jackson Browne to Elton John. You know, any songwriter that is standing up there they owe what they do. He invented singer-songwriting, but it's more than that. He allowed musicians to do what they wanted to do. You know, this is why Hendrix doesn't sound like T-Bone Walker or Freddie King, and he doesn't sing like that. That's why Hendrix is different. That's why we don't perceive Hendrix as a blues guitarist. We're perceiving this psychedelic wonder that is at the forefront, like a Nietzschean god. You know, that's what we perceive. That all goes back to Bob Dylan. He was a superstar. He was worshipped. He was charismatic. And the thing is, all the way through his career, he didn't give up. He's obviously slacking. He's, over a 60-year career, you slacken off. But for especially through the 60s, he's a pioneer. Now, I'm not a big fan of Dylan. I find it difficult. I'm a muso. I like to listen to good music. Oh, God. I like to listen to good musicianship. I like to listen to virtuosity. I'm interested in the musical arrangements. I love lyrics. I love lyrics very much, but Dylan's lyrics are too hard for me. I don't get it. They almost sound mystical to me. But when I hear Hendrix do Along the Watchtower, or I hear the Byrds do Mr. Tambourine Man, suddenly the beauty of that song emerges for me. He is something else. So I feel like I'm at the end of the video because we're at Bob Dylan and he's so important, but I have got the number one, haven't I? So shall I get on with it? At number one, I have, and anyone who's watched this channel will know, Louis Armstrong. I love Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong, for me, if you're a rock musician, you're a pop musician, reggae musician, jazz, fusion, if you're making garage or house or dubstep or reggae, all these 20th century music, for me, we're doing Louis' music. He's that important. Duke Ellington is a jazz musician that elevated composition. He showed how composition could work and change to accommodate all these new ideas, which then go into sort of 20th century popular music. What Louis does for the music is Louis provides the sound of everything. We have this form. We have New Orleans, music. New Orleans jazz, traditional jazz. It's a group improvised form. It comes out of marching music. It utilises the front line of cornet, trombone and clarinet. It can be designed to be performed as you walk down the road. There's no solos as such. It's collective improvisation. It's got a swing pulse which is very march based. If you put all that together, that is what early jazz is. So you take a tune like When the Saints Go Marching In, and then that group can walk down the road with the drummers doing military drumming, but syncopated. That's what you got with the drums, and then the cornet's going to play the tune, but they're going to just twist that tune. That's what the cornet's going to do, and then you're going to have the trombone is going to weave underneath. And then over the top of that, like a little bird soaring above with the clarinet. I'm doing it all here for you. You can all hear it through my mimicry. That's jazz. That's a breakthrough. Louis comes up through that. He's in one of the greatest exponents of New Orleans jazz, which is King Oliver. He's in that group. He moves up to Chicago. He starts to record. He's one of the very first jazz artists to record. Around about 1923, I think, he starts to record. But Louis has an approach, and it's completely down to his virtuosity. He's a virtuoso jazz musician. He's the Mozart of jazz. I know. That whole history has converged on New Orleans to produce Louis Armstrong, who is just a genius musician, and when he's handed that cornet when he's like about 9 years old or whenever it is, when he's in the waif's home, he's gone out one new I think was it Thanksgiving, not Thanksgiving, July the 4th, whenever it is. Anyway, he's gone out at some party that's going on and he's shot some gun off, as you do when you're 9 years old. And he's got arrested and they've stuck him in this waif's home, and the guy that's running the band there has seen some potential and has given a hornet, and as soon as he put that to his mouth, it's as though the whole 20th century music just emerges like this. probably an exaggeration, but it's a lovely romantic thought. That boy putting his there, and that's the sliding doors moment, because what he's going to do when he plays a trumpet, he is going to provide the sound of absolutely everything. If you're a singer, or you're a bass player, or you're a drummer, or you're a guitar player, the phrasing and the way you play goes back to Louis Armstrong. There might be a tiny bit of that DNA, but it's also there. Always there, sorry. It's always within the sound. You know, he's going to influence drummers, because drummers are going to go, you know, he's going, you know that. And the thing is, when you put Louis on, and it's my favourite video on this channel. If you go and find my Louis Armstrong video, you will see me an absolute joy listening to Louis Armstrong recordings and just reacting. I know this is old scratchy recordings, but if you put your ears in, imagine what it would have been like to hear that. And a lot of the time, Louis is further on than the musicians around him. They're taking their lead from him. So often the bands he plays in have that element of sort of that cocktail, you know, jazz age sound. But Louis is not like that. He's always the coolest. And he uses every device in the book. And his sound and phrasing then gets copied onto every single instrument. Drummers are rhythmically going to play like Louis plays rhythmically. And the way he makes the tone, bends the notes, all this stuff is going to end up in music production, in the way you record stuff. You know, he starts singing as well. And he's the most important singer of the 20th century, because he completely changes popular music in terms of how you sing it. Louis does not have to sing the tune, and he can still sing a tune. Louis does not have to sing the words, and he can still be singing the tune. Right? He doesn't have to have a classic voice, a predictable voice. Right? But it's still him. And when you record him and you hear Louis, if that comes on the radio, go, oh, that's Louis Armstrong. He shows the importance of having an individual sound. His importance is groundbreaking. Later on, in the late 20s, early 30s, when he forms a big band, he also lays down the foundations of swing, and is probably as important as Duke Ellington in doing that. That band was so important. By the time he was nearing his death in the late 60s, he was still having hit records, you know. Oh, I've got another phone call coming in just to see this is... Hang on, I'm going to stop the video here and I'll be back in a minute.
I think Stubby's gone overboard with those altered chords, don't you?
I agree. I think Brubeck and Desmond have gone just as far with dissonance as I care to go.
Oh, nonsense. Have you heard Lenny Tristano's latest recording? He reached outer space.
Someday they'll make the cycle and get back to pure old Dixieland. I say atonality is just a passing phase in jazz music. What do you think, Mr. Everett?
Lady, I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
And I'm back again. I'm popular today, aren't I? I keep getting the phone going all the time. I was pretty much at the end of the video anyway. I might put something silly into that space, I don't know. I've got a little advert I was going to put into the first break, so I didn't mind that, so I stopped. Because normally I'll answer the phone on one of the videos, and you know what I'm like. I'll answer the phone, and you can watch me whatever happened. But I thought... you know, I thought I'd stop and start because I decided to put this little advert. Now it's happened a second time. I'm now going to put something in there. So there might be something silly. I don't know. Anyway, I think I've got to the end of this video. If you like this video, then like it. My videos are going... I'm not getting better at this. I'm getting worse. You know, I had a point in YouTube where I got quite professional, didn't I? But now, I feel like it feels like absolute chaos. I feel like I'm in a world of chaos. I mean, these ones I've done, I've really put some work in trying to get this list. I've really had a big think about it, done some research, you know, which I don't normally do. But when I get here in front of you lot, I feel like I'm going into a chaotic world where I don't know what's going on, and it's getting worse. But I hope you enjoyed it. People seem to be liking it. They keep saying, keep going, Andy. You know, keep going. We like it. Don't stop it. Don't change it. So that's what it is. I've tried this week to be a bit more sensible and not go off on tangents and be funny, because last week I was very silly. And I'm going to have to keep my eye on the subscribers, because I don't want them going, oh, he's gone silly now. I'm going to stop subscribing, because I'm so close to 20,000 people at the moment. And I'm looking forward to reaching 20,000. I feel like I've achieved something then. And of course, as soon as I hit 20,000, then the next one's 30,000, isn't it? And I want to get there as quick as I possibly can. And will I get there producing these sort of chaotic, you know, incoherent videos? Was it coherent? Was it all right? Did you enjoy it? But that's who I think are they're not the only 10 other musicians. What other musicians would be very important in the history of 20th century pop music? I would say Lonnie Johnson, who with Eddie Lang made some incredibly important guitar recordings. Lonnie Johnson really invented single line soloing on guitar. And then that was put onto an electric guitar by Charlie Christian. And Charlie Christian, his electric guitar playing, as I mentioned when I talked about Chuck Berry, very, very important in the history of 20th century music. There's producers that we haven't mentioned. You know, the producers are so important. Whether it's Jerry Wexler or Ahmet Erkin at Atlantic Records. You know, there's other characters that are very important, because this is, you know, the 10 greatest musicians. But many of these were musicians. If you take somebody like George Martin was probably a more capable musician than the Beatles were, and he brought that to bear on the Beatles. So there's all those types of musicians. I think another musician I think is very important was Eddie Cochran, because Eddie Cochran just took that rock and roll and pushed it a little bit further. And when you listen to something like Summertime Blues, I can hear the beginnings of heavy rock. Blue Cheer went on and did a cover version of Summertime Blues that came out in around about 67. And when you listen to that, there is the beginnings of heavy metal. I think that Blue Cheer tune is where you go, this isn't just heavy rock, it's not just rock music, this is heavy metal. Although Cream play a part, you know, Sunshine of Your Love, that riff is heavy. You put those two things together, and we're very close to then Communication Breakdown and some of the Jeff Beck stuff, and you know, and then Black Sabbath come in. And Tony Iommi, I think, is a very important musician in the history of music. I think Miles Davis is a very important musician in the history of music, not just on jazz, but he's very important in the development of sort of ambient music, electronic experimentation. Brian Eno took his lead, and Brian Eno is a very important musician. It does go on, and I'm throwing some off the top of my head that I think, you know, should they be mentioned on here? Giorgio Moroder. I mean, he takes like Kraftwerk. we just, you know, there's certain musicians that are very, very important in history. But what I've tried to do here is really bring it down to sort of supercharged importance and multi-layered importance. We can look at a musician that's pioneered something. You know, I mean, there's musicians that have done things that have got forgotten, but they were the beginning of that. And there's other musicians, and I'm because I haven't planned this. Who would be like that? Who's a musician that did something for the first time, and they have sort of been forgotten that they were the person that did that? It's very hard because these are obscure musicians, but there's also musicians that pioneered one thing, but they were definitely the sole originator of it. That would be like Larry Graham with slap bass. He invented slap bass. Frank Gambale invented sweep picking. I'm not on about economy picking. I'm not about just arpeggiating across. I'm about continually playing in a certain way, where your plectrum. I'm getting all technical now. I didn't want to on this video. But Gambale, we can point out. These are important musicians technically, you know. And there's musicians that did certain things. Like, for example, here's one. The Hollies, great band, great British band, and I wish I could remember the name of the drummer. But this was the first guy to put a mic inside the bass drum. And by pushing that bass drum up front, that's the beginning of disco, it's the beginning of funk, it's the beginning of heavy metal and all that double bass drumming in it, all that bit. And I wish I knew the name of the guy that was in the Hollies. And that's the thing, I can't remember his name. That's the point I'm trying to make. I don't know who that guy is, but his importance in the history of music is very important. So there are so many more. So I apologise if I haven't covered them all. The whole point of videos like this is just to get the discussion going, get you thinking, get you inspired to check out a musician you probably haven't checked out before, or reaffirming an idea you had about a musician that you really love. And it's just about taking the journey, and with something like this, it's getting all these opposing music. It's the first time I've talked about country music on here. I've talked about Bob Dylan so many times, even though he's light years away from what I listen to. So that's all interesting, isn't it, to bring all that in. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, then you can like it by pressing the like button. You can actually press that like button and nothing will happen to you. You won't get sold anything or pulled in anything. You can click it right now. And if you click it and YouTube goes, ooh, a lot of people are liking that video, then the algorithm will sort of point more over towards me and I will become more successful, which is what I need. I need that to happen. And if you want to see some more videos, then you can subscribe by pressing the subscribing button there. Now, that's not going to hurt you. I've subscribed to hundreds of channels, right? And there's the channels I subscribed to from years ago that I don't look at anymore. It doesn't matter. Nothing's happened to me. They never see any of that stuff, right? Subscription doesn't. It doesn't matter that much, really. But when YouTubers get together, it is the thing by which we measure each other. Always that, and so it doesn't really matter how many subscribers you've got. There's people out there with 1,000 subscribers that have millions of views. I've never had a video that's had more than 100,000 views. That's the most I've ever had. But we measure each other by saying, press the subscribe button. Come on, I'm so close to 20,000 at the moment. I think I'm 200 or 300 away from 20,000. I could have it done by the end of the week, and I could announce it on Facebook, and all my friends can pat me on the back and think I'm a good person for being able to achieve something so important in our modern culture. If you want to support me financial support is always the best support, isn't it? Then you can do that by going over to my Patreon. There's tons of content over there, and it's not just more videos like this. There's all sorts of different stuff, including the now legendary Patreon meeting when we all get together. Sometimes we have a guest and they come in and they get to interview the guest, and sometimes we just hook up and just chat about music. People from all over the world, incredible musicians. So if you want to do that, you could become a patron. The link's down there. And if you don't want to become a patron, but you like what I do and you want to support me, now there's a little dribble of money coming through my PayPal tip jar. The link's down there, and that's really helping the channel at the moment. And I got really in trouble last week because my laptop blew up and I couldn't make proper videos, and I've been able to get through that, and I've been able to support myself and get a few extra things because of the PayPal tip jar. We all know how difficult it is for many of us at the moment financially. The world is in a rocky place. Sounds like I'm going to go into an advert in a minute, doesn't it? And I'm going to say you need to go and buy gold, but I'm not going to do that. And we're all feeling it, so that really helps support this channel. And at the moment, for me, all I can say, and this will come out eventually, it is a matter of life and death for me at the moment with this channel. It's what's keeping me and my family going, and all will be revealed perhaps at some point in the future. So if you could put a little bit into the old PayPal tip jar. I feel like I'm begging now. But if you don't want to put in any money into the PayPal tip jar, I would suggest you buy some gold. What with World War III coming, gold, being a noble metal, will not be affected by the radiation. Of course, you'll be dead, but your money and your wealth will be safe, buried under your lawn in your garden, in the shape of big lumps of lovely yellow gold. So why don't you go and buy some gold now, so that your vast fortune, if you have one, can be stored away. And I've given you that for free. I'm not getting paid to say that, but if you want to toddle along to any sort of right-wing YouTuber, I'm sure if you just wait, you will get an advert for gold. Or maybe some sort of meat animal that you wouldn't normally, like a deer or maybe an otter, that you can get 100% otter meat farmed, by real men who shoot it with a gun. You might get an advert for that type of stuff. These are the adverts I get, you see. Once you get to a certain age, you are just right-wing, aren't you? There's nothing you can do about it. You get to a certain age. I've always been a very liberal lefty, but I find myself getting drawn to the right all the time. And it comes out on this channel. And I'm sure because there's a lot of older men, that's just the way life is, isn't it? So you end up watching these, Ben Shapiro or somebody. I'm sat there watching Ben Shapiro, and he's talking away, and he's going on about how, the family is the best thing, and everyone should get married and have kids and all that type of stuff, and then suddenly he pauses for an advert, and this advert comes on, and it's for like gold or some sort of meat. Why don't they combine it together and have gold and meat? Sounds like a sort of Belgian progressive rock band, doesn't it? I promised not to go do this week. I thought I did so much of this last week, but here I am. I know what it is. It's because I stopped. I've stopped, and then I've started again, and I feel like I've started on another video. What's the time? Because I've got to go and do something. I'm in a bit of a busy day today. I've got gigs at the weekend, so I've had to come in here, and I can't switch the phone off because I might get important calls, and I've had to try and get these YouTube videos done. I do four videos a week at least. Think about it, and that's why you get this. It has to be. My videos have to be like this. I find myself explaining myself a lot at the moment. I don't know what that is for. It's a new thing. 2024. The you Andy had to explain himself. Right. I'm going to stop now. And I've had an idea for a video that I wanted to do, and it's going to be a Philosophy Sunday, and I'm in the mood to chat now, so I'm going to do it right now. So thanks for watching. The next video I'm going to talk about is going to be about Live Aid. I was thinking about Live Aid this morning, and I'm going to be chatting about that. So watch out for that video as well. Thanks all for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.
What's your favorite Crimson album?
You see, it's difficult, that one, because Crimson are sort of multiple bands, really. I think.
What's your favorite era?
Well, it's basically once Bruford joined in '72 onwards, that's kind of when Crimson really, excites me. I mean, the '74, the Red era Red is one of my favourite records. But if you want an album that shows everything that Crimson did, I think Thrack's a fantastic record because it's got the two drummers, Pat Mastelotto on there, got Bill Bruford on there, got Tony on bass, Tony Levin on bass, and with Fripp and Ballou. So you've kind of got everything that's great about Crimson on there. We did a gig with Stickmen, which is Pat Mastelotto and Tony Levin, and they were all those guys, really, really nice. But they were massive heroes to me. I mean, Mastelotto played the solo album I did, and he was just everything you'd want. He was like a really cool, laid back, best drummer in the world type dude. You know what I mean? He was just really nice. It was really cool. Wow. But yeah, it was. He was, But I still feel like a competition winner. You know what I mean? It's like I'm gonna hang out with Pat Mastelotto tonight. This is gonna be all right. It's like Tony Levin, everybody. My heroes. Whereas with a lot of the prog people, it doesn't really, because I like with a lot of the neo-prog stuff, I didn't even know that existed, really. I mean, but I've seen IQ, and IQ were really good live, and I've seen a lot of those bands, and I can see why, but just for some reason, I don't think Northamptonshire in the early 90s had neo-prog. I think it just didn't exist. I didn't even know it was there. I didn't, I knew Porcupine Tree through the Voyage 34 single. So I thought they were like a psychedelic rock band from the early 90s. And then when I met James Allen and got back into Progland, they were playing the Royal Albert Hall. The last time I'd seen, they were playing to like 50 people in the Northampton Road Menders. So, and I was just like, how has this happened? And I was just, and they're brilliant, absolutely brilliant band. But it's not it's not that I've got a problem with a lot of prog. I just haven't heard it. Just sort of passed me by, really, which is ridiculous, really, isn't it?